Good evening, everybody. On behalf of the Center for Anglo-German Cultural Relations, I bid you a very warm welcome and a particular warm welcome, of course, to our speaker, Andrew Hines. Dr. Hines is one of our special fellows at the Center for Anglo-German Relations, in fact, very special, because he's the Thyssen Fellow. And in that capacity, he pursues a particular project, namely the meaning of cultural relations in the post-Brexit era, with a particular focus, obviously, on Anglo-German matters. Dr. Hines is, apart from a fellow with us at the center, he also holds a lectureship in world philosophy at SOAS. And his academic career started student days at the University of Oregon, the University of Tübingen. He did then an MA at a city university in Dublin, and indeed a PhD here at Queen Mary with us. And his Dr. Vater is also amongst us tonight, I take it. It's Angus Nichols. One of the truly remarkable achievements of Andrew Hines is, in fact, the book version of his PhD, which was published last autumn with Legenda under the title Metaphor in European Philosophy After Nietzsche, an Intellectual History. So indeed, Andrew is an intellectual historian who looks in particular to the meaning of metaphor in all respects, in political contexts, in cultural contexts, and as a phenomenon in, shall we say, cultural comprehension, or indeed miscomprehension, because the title of his lecture tonight is, and this is a slight variation to what the announcement promised, to Grenzen of Misunderstanding, reflections on a phenomenon at the heart of current Anglo-German cultural relations. It is an absolute pleasure, Andrew, to have you with us tonight, and we are eagerly awaiting your lecture. We will have a Q&A session afterwards, and for that, I would like you to use the chat function. You can also start using this during the lecture, but of course you won't get a response whilst Andrew is talking. So with that, over to you, Andrew.
Thank you so much, Rudiger. It's an absolute pleasure to be here, and thank you so much for your kind invitation and all your support as a line manager and colleague. And just a few other quick thank yous. I just feel like I should properly thank the Thyssen Foundation for the generous support and funding for the research project, and also to the Department of Religion and Philosophies at SOAS, where I'm a lecturer, because they give me time to focus on my research duties here. So, and finally, thank you to everyone out there in cyberspace attending. I know we're all going through our own variety of lockdowns. Mine, as you will notice, is unlike the promotional photo. I do not have long hair and a short beard, but now a very long beard and very short hair. So it's how I'm attempting to cope with this experience. As Rudiger mentioned, the title of my talk has changed. And that's originally I was going to speak about mythos and Kunstmythos. And I realized that distinction I was interested in was actually part of a bigger phenomenon that I wanted to address. So I'm still going to address the spirit of that original talk, but I've worked it into this larger focus. And just a few things to say. I'm approaching this talk tonight from the perspective of an academic. And I generally work in, as Rudiger mentioned, intellectual history and philosophy, and also as a comparativist, doing my PhD in comparative literature. But it's a public lecture, so I've really tried to make it have a broad of relevance for non-specialists as possible. So hopefully there'll be plenty of time for questions and clarifications and discussion at the end. So without further ado, I want to begin by highlighting the particular focus of this talk. And that focus is a recent phenomenon in Western democracies. The phenomenon is that seemingly out of the blue, cultural forms that we thought we knew are shifting. And this meaning shift is causing a profound civic misunderstanding. And in some cases, as in the storming of the US Capitol on the 6th of January, 2021, civic unrest. So take the English word democracy, for example. It's a word that we all think we know, and it forms part of the symbolic order of Western culture. Yet in the 2016 Gina Miller court case against the British government, the judges that ruled in Miller's favor were branded enemies of the people by the Daily Mail, and Miller herself was labeled a traitor to democracy for her actions. Yet she stated that she led the action against the government precisely because of her concern that democracy was under threat. If we fast forward to 5 years and a group of pro-Trump rioters, partially incited by false claims that the democratic process of the presidential election had been tampered with, forced their way into the House chamber on the US Capitol building on the 6th of January. Reporting on these events, BBC's North American correspondent Aline McBool asked, how safe is US democracy? So what I want to highlight here is in both the Miller trial and the January 6th riots, key symbols attached to the larger democratic process, High Court judges and the US Capitol building, were subjected to verbal and physical assaults over claims that they were thwarting the very democracies they're symbolically attached to. Yet these responses were met with shock and alarm. The Daily Mail headline, "Beyond Generating Criticism in the Press and on Social Media," was the subject of, I think, over 1,000 complaints to the Independent Press Standard Organization, and it was subjected to scrutiny by both the Bar Council and the House of Lords Constitution Committee. And of course, in the case of the January 6th riots, the result was the lockdown of the US Capitol and the lead up to and during the inauguration of Joe Biden as the US president. And in addition, the impeachment of former US President Donald Trump. And as we now know, he's been acquitted. But during the riot itself, the German Foreign Minister Heiko Maas tweeted, I'm quoting now, "Trump und seine Unterstützer sollten aufhören, die Demokratie mit Füßen zu treten." Trump and his supporters should stop trampling on democracy. How can democracy mean such conflicting things? This phenomenon of misunderstanding is what we are concerned with today. And the phenomenon has taken central stage in Anglo-German cultural relations in the wake of Brexit. The relevance I see for Anglo-German matters is not simply that Germany is a major player in the European Union, but it also took Brexit incredibly personally. So as Nick Leakey, the deputy head of mission at the British Embassy in Berlin between 2014 and 2018, told me in an interview, quoting now, "The language used to express shock over the result of the referendum switched to first person. There was a real sense of something they, the British, have done to us, the Germans," or maybe I should do it in reverse since I'm in the UK. But this intensely personal tone was, of course, echoed, if you remember, in a letter from German leaders to Britain, published in the Times newspaper in January 2019. It was a plea not to leave the EU, and it was written not simply in reference to the perceived practical benefits of remaining in the Union, but rather the language of missing Britain. "We will miss you," they wrote. And then, like one facing a relationship that one doesn't want to end, list all the things such as pubs, tea, black humor that they would miss. And this personal dimension speaks to how deeply what I'm calling misunderstanding is today felt in the public sphere of Western democracy, like the space between Britain and Germany. I'm suggesting that misunderstanding is perhaps a useful term to think about this phenomenon. And I'm using the term misunderstanding because we see in things like the conflicting meaning of democracy, a clash of understanding over commonly known ideas or symbols within a particular symbolic order. I'm aware, however, in doing that maybe I might be attaching the word misunderstanding to this phenomenon in a way that's a bit of a departure from some fairly common everyday definitions. So for example, the Oxford English Dictionary, it defines the verb misunderstand as to fail to understand rightly, to take something in a wrong sense. So the OED definition reflects something like the empiricist John Locke's assumption outlined in 1689's An Essay Concerning Human Understanding. And the assumption there is that judgment can indeed be misled. And it's interesting to note that one of the things that Locke highlights that can lead the judgment astray, lead it into misunderstanding, is cultural forms, such as metaphors, symbols, and myths, like we might be observing in the public sphere. By connecting up the word misunderstanding with this phenomenon of democracy and its associated cultural forms as meaning two different things, I'm certainly suggesting, yes, of course, there's a failure of understanding. And perhaps there are times when a straightforward empirical approach like Locke's is needed in regard to the misunderstandings of the moment. But by calling this phenomenon misunderstanding, I'm not always linking up a failure of understanding with a failure to understand rightly. On the other hand, I'm not defining misunderstanding as a failure to understand because of some kind of meaning clash over a commonly understood idea, as in a hard relativism, so that all things are simply a clash of different worldviews and different perspectives. I think this would be akin to a vulgarized Nietzschean idea of understanding. And I say vulgarized because I think we often forget that the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche had a very nuanced view of truth, though he's famous for critiquing it. And he had a very nuanced view of its distinctions from other forms of correct or right understanding. He does famously invert a position like Locke's when he writes, "What then is truth? A mobile army of metaphors, metonymies, anthropomorphisms. In short, a sum of human relations. Truths are illusions," Nietzsche writes, of which we have forgotten their illusions. And it's true that the human relation to truth certainly does create a certain type of relativism, but it's a metaphysical and propositional truth that he's critiquing, not facts. And in the Nietzschean sense of misunderstanding here, it's a misunderstanding of a human being's own capacity for knowledge. According to Nietzsche, human beings seem to have this built-in tendency to forget that that which we call truth is actually a product of language, history, power relations. And while this check to human hubris is a very important interpretive tool, alone, I would argue it doesn't fully account for the clashes over meaning we're seeing today and the need we have for a path forward. So my main argument then tonight in our time together is that the type of misunderstanding we're experiencing in the public sphere of Western democracies is neither reducible to the common empirical definition, where someone has failed to understand rightly, nor is it reducible to a simplistic relativistic definition where there's a clash of different worldviews, or even more Nietzschean view, a nuanced view where we forget the role of language and history in producing truth. There are plenty of examples of all three where we could apply definitions like this for certain instances. But my argument is that the phenomenon of misunderstanding we're seeing in the public sphere in Western democracies takes place at a Grenzen of the understanding as it encounters commonly understood ideas and symbols. So the German word Grenze means border, limit, or in rarer cases, frontier. A limit, a border, and a frontier are all slightly different things. And so for the purpose of this talk, I want to leave the term untranslated to capture this ambiguity. Arguing, however, that misunderstanding takes place in this ambiguous border space is not simply arguing for two different worldviews, but rather different aspects of the understanding finding itself in conflict with itself in the public sphere. And one place we can look to highlight how different aspects of the understanding find themselves in conflict is through cultural forms, such as symbols, metaphors, myths, or even abstract ideas like democracy that have a host of symbols and metaphors and myths attached to them. Each culture has their own symbolic order and where these cultural forms exist, but there are also shared symbolic orders such as Western democracy or European philosophy, where different languages, for example, English and German, still have key ideas and symbols such as judges, rule of law, democracy that they share. And I think cultural forms are a useful lens onto this phenomenon of misunderstanding, precisely because they're at once verifiable, so we can go to the archives, find the Daily Mail headline, and yet they are relative. What constitutes an enemy? What constitutes a people? Therefore, neither side of the crack clarifies the wider phenomenon of misunderstanding when the meaning of these terms shifts. And so I want to think about misunderstanding as taking place on a Grenze between different aspects of the understanding. And to do this, I'm going to group the remainder of my talk around two different Grenzen, the plural of Grenze, where the understanding finds itself in conflict. It's the borderlands that understanding is trying to navigate as it interprets cultural forms in our historic moment. Some will be instances where it's difficult to judge between two things. Other times, it's the Grenze that creates the conditions for misunderstanding. But they're two examples of different aspects of the understanding finding itself in conflict. And these two are, on the one hand, the local versus the global, and secondly, consensus and false consensus. So after a somewhat lengthy introduction, let me turn to the first Grenze, a Grenze between the local and the global. So Grenze 1, between the local and the global. So I'm going to start with a literal Grenze. On a visit to Dublin in April 2019, when concerns about a no-deal Brexit and a hard border in Ireland were still very much in the air, Angela Merkel met with the Irish Taoiseach and a group of people from Northern Ireland in the border area. And in that conversation, stories were told by the group about their experiences of loss during the Troubles. Merkel said she was very moved by these stories, and I quote her now, "I lived behind the Iron Curtain," she said, "so I know only too well what it means once borders vanish. What I have heard here will encourage me to explore ways and means to continue the peaceful coexistence." It's a poignant and personal example of finding commonality through a symbol of shared experience. And in this case, it's the symbol of a border. It's also instructive about the way in which something intensely personal and local can simultaneously speak with such global significance. Merkel's experience of living behind the Iron Curtain in East Germany has an extremely distinct sense of place. Even the term Iron Curtain has distinctly symbolic associations that is linked to a particular geography and a particular moment in history. In the same way, the Troubles and the Irish border are also termed with a distinct sense of place. Yet, despite the intensely local nature of the symbolic associations of terms like the Irish border or the Irish Iron Curtain, the experience of living behind a border suddenly becomes this global symbol that connects Merkel and the group from Northern Ireland and the border. Perhaps we might say that it's an example of political language at its most empathetic and constructive. Yet, despite such moments of local and global harmony, the Grenze between the local and the global is causing our own understanding distress as of late. In another interview before this talk, in a conversation about Brexit and the Belfast Agreement with Adam Smith, the head of news at BBC Northern Ireland, he said, and I'm quoting now, "Brexit is chipping away at the ambiguity of the settlement." As a reminder, the Belfast Agreement, sometimes known as the Good Friday Agreement, includes assertions about not changing the status of Northern Ireland without its people's consent and their somewhat constructively ambiguous right to be Irish or British citizen or both. And because 55.8% of the electorate in Northern Ireland voted to remain in the EU, Brexit understandably raised concerns about self-determination and allegiance. A local matter has once again become an incredibly global concern. And interpreting the line or Grenze between the two becomes increasingly difficult to interpret without the flexibility the ambiguity provides. In many ways, without such ambiguity, it's easier to firmly pick a side or perhaps confuse the two. The broader phenomenon we are concerned with is how intensely local cultural forms can be interpreted as having global significance. Who determines the meaning of this? So as we saw with Merkel, concerning her concern for those living in the north in the border area, a symbol can provide unity, but there's also a concern that as the ambiguity of the settlement is chipped away at, geopolitical issues, Brexit in this case, may affect local concerns, blurring the Grenze, both literal and the figurative one. So I think there's a broader principle at work here. And it's a broader principle that we may see in many different aspects of Western democracies, whether through Brexit, the American elections, or perhaps even the intensity of the pandemic and different aspects associated with that. For example, the conspiracy theories around anti-vax and wearing masks. And the misunderstanding comes when one attempts to interpret the global significance of local concerns or vice versa. The key question for me about this is it's a question of scope and how we interpret the scope of a cultural form. And so I want to shift gears a little bit, and I want to focus on this question of how we interpret the scope of a cultural form by reading a poem from Patrick Kavanagh. This is a 1951 sonnet Patrick Kavanagh wrote. And in the poem, he reflects on a local feud between two farmers in rural Ireland over an eighth of an acre of land, in contrast to the global events of the Munich Agreement in 1938. A dispute over an eighth of an acre isn't necessarily immediately an event of mythical importance, but that's precisely Kavanagh's point. So I'm going to read now Patrick Kavanagh's epic in its entirety. I have lived in important places, times. When great events were decided, who owned? That half a rood of rock, a no man's land, surrounded by our pitchforked arm claims. I heard the Duffy shouting, damn your soul. An old McCab stripped to the waist, seen, stepped the plot defying the blue cast steel. Here is the march along these iron stones. That was the year of the Munich bother, which was more important. I inclined to lose my faith in Ballyrush and Gorton, till Homer's ghost came whispering to my mind. He said, I made the Iliad from such a local row. Gods make their own importance. Why does Kavanagh invoke the poet Homer at the end? Is he insecure about considering local conflicts in rural Ireland when the world was being thrust into a world war? Is it the recognition that the poet determines a sense of drama about place? Both? As Kavanagh's biographer Antoinette Quinn reminds us, epic is customarily read as a validation of the local as artistic material. In 1975, the poet Seamus Heaney even invokes the opening line of epic to perhaps add gravitas and color to a poem about his own childhood and school days growing up in Derry, writing, well, as Kavanagh said, we have lived in important places, the lonely scarp of St. Colum's College, where I billeted for 6 years. And while it makes sense that Heaney would invoke the power of Kavanagh to speak not only to the validity, but the significance, the local and the poetic imagination, Kavanagh's poem can also speak to us about how local cultural forms shape our understanding. When Homer's ghost tells Kavanagh that he made the Iliad from a local row, we could certainly read this as a sense of place giving power to poetry. However, we could equally read it as suggesting to us that it's the poet who creates significance and deepens a particular sense of the mythical. To quote the end of the poem, gods make their own importance. And this is a reading that Quinn feels should be given equal weight. And it's this tension that helps us perhaps reframe the misunderstanding between the local and the global. Perhaps, in this case, the Grenzen isn't between the local and the global, but rather between the power of place and the power of the poet. Or perhaps in our case, the power of the politician. Kavanagh's idea of the poet giving power to place also helps us begin to refine our own idea about what's involved in the phenomenon of misunderstanding we are concerned with today. The language of the local is ultimately colloquial in that it's not formal. Idealized language, that it's not formal or idealized language, but it's used by everyday speaker. The metaphors and myth contained within such language are ubiquitous and not attributable to a single author. Yet they become crafted in a particular manner when put into a poem. It's fair enough if you are using a local turn of phrase to describe a beautiful sunrise, but what happens when local language becomes crafted for more global political purposes? This question leads us to our second Grenzen. And can I just actually quickly pause here and ask for the moderators to give me a quick wave at a 5-minute mark so I don't overstretch my time. Thank you. Okay, so moving on to our second Grenzen, Grenzen 2. This is between consensus and false consensus. So when German Foreign Minister Heiko Maas tweeted that Trump and his supporters should stop trampling on democracy, he uses the word trample, or in German mit Füßen zu treten, literally to trample underfoot, as a metaphor. We can't literally trample on ideas, although perhaps when I'm talking about philosophy to my wife, she may appreciate if she could. But the violence of this metaphor reflects the sense of shock and radical misunderstanding that German politicians experience over events in Western democracies. One way to interpret this radical sense of misunderstanding is perhaps through what the philosopher Jürgen Habermas called the yardsticks of democracy. In a 2009 essay where he discusses the way in which political theories remain tied closely to their context of origin, Habermas writes that political confrontation with the fact that our population broadly supported the Nazi regime remains for us more than just one topic among others up to the present day. Democracy in Germany was therefore the yardstick against which we also measured the politics of the day. He goes on to remind the reader that in the case of his own generation, it was impossible not to take a stance after what he poetically describes as the caesura in world history in 1945. Habermas's metaphorical use of the word caesura is telling and is useful for thinking about the boundary between consensus and false consensus. A caesura itself is a type of Grenzen, and we often associate it with a break in a metrical line of poetry that is denoted by some type of grammatical marker. So in the case of the Kavanagh poem Epic, the first line contains what's called a terminal caesura. It comes at the end of the line. In this case, the marker is in the form of a comma. So the beginning of the line again, Kavanagh writes, "I have lived in important places, comma, times." The caesura in the form of a comma interrupts our reading, and with the subtle power of grammar that only poetry can provide sometimes, creates not simply a grammatical Grenzen, but a conceptual one. The comma makes us not only pause in our reading of the poem, providing a rhythmic Grenzen, it also pauses our thought. We wonder, why does Kavanagh not simply run the phrase together with the more common English expression times and places? Suddenly we ask ourselves, does this caesura speak to something more deeply, such as the tension between the local and the global we cited? Two nations, in the case of this poem, Ireland and Germany, may live in the same calendar year, but the sense of place experienced by those in the Munich bother that Kavanagh references and the dispute over the ownership of farmland take place in fundamentally different worlds. So both the rhythmic and conceptual Grenzen between places and times alerts us to a tension and a rupture. And in the case of Habermas, though it's just a passing phrase at the beginning of this essay, the caesura of 1945 signals to us as readers the interruption to the flow of time, both a local and global history, and the necessity of a distinct position in a theoretical space that this interruption demanded. Habermas sums up this very principle when he writes, as I mentioned a moment ago, that the political confrontation with the fact that our majority of the population was broadly supported the Nazi regime remains not one topic among other. Democracy is the yardstick of measurement. And the yardstick of measurement is necessitated by the caesura of 1945 for Habermas. The flow of history changes, language must be developed in a new direction. And while Habermas's mentor Theodor Adorno said to write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric, Habermas perhaps asks us, is there a way to think language beyond barbarism, to begin with enlightenment and public reason anew? I should stress that both perhaps have equally good reasons for their positions. But what does this have to do with our second Grenzen, consensus and false consensus? The caesura of 1945 for Habermas is a historical demand of the need for a criterion to judge between consensus and false consensus. So one particularly significant place where Habermas articulates this need is in his debate with Hans-Georg Gadamer. In an article entitled "Our Hermeneutics Claim to Universality" from 1970, Habermas highlights this very Grenzen between consensus and false consensus, and provides his own definition of misunderstanding in contrast to the definition of the understanding famously associated with philosophical hermeneutics, the philosophical development Gadamer is most often associated with. And in this debate, he famously criticizes Gadamer and the inability of the tradition of philosophical hermeneutics to provide a, quote, universal criterion which would tell us when we were caught up in false consciousness of a pseudo-normal understanding. This concern Habermas has is perhaps poignant for the phenomenon of misunderstanding we are discussing. But before we turn to why he thinks it's relevant, I just want to clarify what philosophical hermeneutics is and why Habermas is critiquing it. So the question of the role of cultural forms and understanding took on a particular tone in the movement philosophical hermeneutics. For those unfamiliar with the term, hermeneutics in its most simple form means interpretation. And it comes from the Attic Greek, hermenoion, which means to utter, to explain, to translate, and was used by thinkers who discussed how divine messages or mental images are expressed in human language. It's also associated with the winged messenger god Hermes in Greek mythology, who carried divine tidings to mortals. It's also a term that in Europe is often associated with the activity of interpreting an authoritative and often ancient text, whether that be philosophical, religious, or literary. If you Google the term hermeneutics, for example, and you're likely to get the results relating to biblical hermeneutics, the principles and practice related to the interpretation of the Bible. This tradition as the art of interpretation of a sacred text was well established when the German theologian Daniel Friedrich Schleiermacher, in an attempt to avoid a growing conflict in European society between religion and science, attempted to set out the universal human conditions for understanding that form the ground for the knowledge of all fields of study. Schleiermacher set the tone for the debate that would follow on the more philosophically reflected question. And there's a lot of history about the term that I won't go into, but to zoom forward, by the time we get to Gadamer, there's an assumption about the conditions for human understanding of the world. And that's that language is the medium through which we experience our interpretation of the world. And this is the key idea for why Habermas critiques. So just bear with me through this last section. This experience is reflective, which means our understanding reflects the local colloquial situation we find ourselves in. So the example Gadamer uses for this, to help you kind of wrap your head around it, is a good conversation. If you're in a good conversation, you feel relaxed and it takes twists and turns all of its own. Neither party is kind of willing it in a particular direction. And Gadamer writes that, quoting him now, understanding or its failure is like an event that happens to us. Thus, we can say that something was a good conversation or that it was ill-fated. And all of this shows that a conversation has a spirit of its own, and that the language in which it's conducted bears its own truth within it, i.e. that it allows something to emerge which henceforth existed. So the last idea in this phrase kind of harkens back to the introduction and harkens back to the Nietzschean concept of the position on truth that we saw in the introduction. And despite the differences between these thinkers, there's certainly a similarity as they come from, as Nietzsche emerged from a similar intellectual historical context that Gadamer was drawing on. And there are many aspects in this sentiment about this kind of reflective aspect of language that Habermas finds really useful. So, for example, Habermas finds it quite constructive to consider the meaning of language as determined by colloquial communication. For Habermas, it moves him away from a view like Chomsky's, whose system of universal grammar, which understands the ability of an ideal speaker in full command of an abstract rule system. For Habermas, this leaves out the pragmatic dimension in which language is transformed into the language of actual living everyday speakers. So he's not all critical. But the point that's really important for us tonight is the view of hermeneutics, according to Habermas, that understanding is something that happens to us, as that quote said. It doesn't allow us to determine when the everyday colloquial use of language has been distorted. It does not tell us when a misunderstanding has occurred. Habermas writes, "We thus have no universal criterion at our disposal, which we could tell we were caught up in a false consensus of pseudo-normal understanding. The limit experience," he's using the word Grenze here, the Grenze of hermeneutics thus consist in the discovery of systematically produced misunderstanding, without at first being able to comprehend them. Tradition, Habermas writes, is the vehicle not only for the objectivity of language, but for repressiveness of a power relationship. So what I've tried to do by highlighting this is highlight a slightly different definition of misunderstanding that we can look at, besides the two I outlined in the beginning. But I want to problematize this as I draw to a close now with a contemporary example. The reason this is a Grenze where misunderstanding can occur is because of the difficulty of judging between a normal part of colloquial communication, how we express ourselves in everyday manner, and a distorted communication. Somehow it's not entirely clear. It's perhaps easy if one's looking at from the outside at highly inflammatory propaganda. But what about if one is looking at a less clear-cut example? And I think we can find such an example in the 2017 Conservative Party conference, where prior to becoming Prime Minister, Boris Johnson made headlines by calling on the party to let the British lion roar. So it's obviously a metaphorical reference to Britain as a roaring lion and the power it could have in a post-Brexit economy. It's certainly a rousing turn of phrase, and it's quite a common cultural form that makes up Britain's symbolic order, stretching back to Richard I. Although the history nerd in me has to say, as an aside, that being said, medieval heraldry across several European nations contains images of lions, one notable example being the coat of arms of Denmark. But that aside, it certainly doesn't mean that the lion hasn't taken on its own significance in contemporary British thought, or that Johnson's metaphor isn't persuasive. Whether we agree with it or not, we all know the assumption of Britain, the association of Britain with the lion. We're familiar with that. And that's precisely what makes it difficult. Because it's not simply the fact that it's persuasive, but rather it's a part of our everyday colloquial consensus of communication. So is it the case that simply because we disagree with something that someone has said from our colloquial communication, that it means it's distorted? Or that it's a false understanding? So I think if we return to these dichotomy of views on misunderstanding I mentioned at the beginning, it would be nice to maybe lapse into a hard relativism at this point and just say, understanding is simply multiple different views, and each person is locked within those. But as we have seen, that alone won't help us with this particular phenomenon. And Habermas himself even writes at the end of this essay, critique too remains bound to traditional context, which it reflects. So despite the nuance of Habermas, which is to be aspired to in my view, I don't think his definition of systematically produced misunderstandings provides us with an answer to the phenomenon we are concerned with. For as we have seen, many of the miscommunications of the moment involve cultural forms that are in a much less clear-cut manner distorted than simply the clearly defined instances of systematically produced misunderstandings, perhaps from history. So I'm concluding now. As I highlighted in the beginning, my main argument is that the type of misunderstanding we're experiencing in the public sphere of Western democracies is neither reducible to the common empirical definition, nor is it reducible to a more relativistic definition. Through these two Grenzen, the local and the global, and the consensus and false consensus, I hope I have shown the need to rethink the multi-layered nature of misunderstanding and the type of misunderstanding we might experience in the public sphere of Western democracies today. I don't think that in a 40-minute talk, I'm able to provide an answer to these pressing questions. Hopefully I've provided some useful language to begin to think about misunderstanding. While I can't give a clear-cut answer, however, my thesis that the phenomenon of misunderstanding seems to be different to that different aspects of misunderstanding, I think it finds a partial answer in Kavanagh's poem. So I want to return to that as I close. So Kavanagh writes, Homer's ghost came whispering to my mind. He said, I made the Iliad from such, a local row. Gods make their own importance. The local colloquial aspect of the understanding and the self-creation of that as something of a global epic's importance lies in the hands of the poet. That much is obvious. However, lest we find yet more ammunition to chuck at our political leaders, which there are certainly times for that, we should perhaps remember that Kavanagh himself goes through a journey in this poem. The realization of the fact that local issues become mythical issues is not something he observes about another poet. Rather, Homer's ghost reminds him as the poet that he has the power to transform the local into the global. He has the responsibility not to distort the colloquial communication into false consensus. And when we see that different aspects of the understanding finds itself in conflict with itself, perhaps, I would argue, one step towards a new definition of misunderstanding is the recognition that self-reflection and ownership of one's own creative power must be central in a path forward for healthy democracies. Because the determination of whether a Grenzen is a hard border or a more creative frontier can only be determined by those guarding it. Thank you very much.
Andrew, thank you very much indeed for an absolutely splendid talk. You have given us not just an insight into the scope of cultural forms, but also the scope of what understanding means, what comprehension means, and indeed misunderstanding. Now, by way of opening the discussion, I wanted to ask you whether you see some form of close affinity between misunderstanding and prejudice. I mean, to quote the famous comment by Hannah Arendt in her essay on politics, that we can't do without prejudice. We don't even live without prejudice. That's what Hannah Arendt argued. And interestingly enough, this tallies very much with Gadamer's conception of prejudice. Is it also true for misunderstanding? Do we need misunderstanding?
So just to clarify, you're asking about the link between misunderstanding and prejudice. Perhaps do we need misunderstanding? I mean, in short, yes, we do. And I think that's precisely why, you know, as I was preparing for this talk, I realized that I had about a book's worth of research and that I couldn't cram it all in. And so it was a pleasure to be able to think through some of these ideas. And one of the key things I realized when I was thinking about the Habermas-Gadamer section is the fact that the need to rethink misunderstanding comes precisely from the fact that I'm not sure if Habermas's answer to Gadamer about the question of prejudice fully answers the question for our own time. And that's why I also do think that misunderstanding and prejudice have a close link. Are they the same? However, I think there probably would be a difference, and I would probably be a bit more skeptical of aspect of Gadamer's thought about prejudice. However, I do certainly think there's a lot of similarities, and I fundamentally agree that we need some form of misunderstanding in order to then find understanding. They have to coexist in some kind of constructive manner, I think, is what I would say.
Thank you very much. Let me just refer to the chat. We have one question here by Peter Harms. I would like to know Mr. Hines' thoughts about the apparent ownership of cultural understanding, colonized curricula, anti-workism, weaponization of opinion through anonymized media platforms, blurs borders between local and global. Any comments on that, Andrew? The blurring of borders through basically also the social media.
Yeah, I have two different thoughts that might not necessarily be related, but we can work out the border between them.
Yes.
I think on the one hand, my response would be that with the ownership of cultural understanding that was mentioned in the first part of that question, I'm speaking in a very broad manner and in slightly overly noble manner there at the end. But it's an attempt to perhaps provide the need that intellectual reflection has to sometimes draw a line and move into a more self-reflective moment in moments of profound crisis like we are in now. And so I just wanted to highlight that. In relation to the blurring of borders, I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. The reason I bring it up is because of the fact I was hoping to kind of highlight the fact that the two different Grenzes bleed into each other. So the local and the global only becomes a problem, or one of the times I should say when it becomes a problem, is precisely when we realize that our consensus has suddenly become false consensus. And so I think it's not a perfect answer, but I think that's how I could best answer it, which is that I think the blurring of the local and the global is this inevitable phenomenon of communication. But the risk becomes when it suddenly becomes a moment of false consensus. So I think the two parts of my talk go together in that manner.
Thank you for that. We have quite a number of thank yous, warm thank yous for a wonderful talk and for a very nuanced talk, which I think is exactly the point. I get a hint from my fellow panelists that we have two raised hands. Angus, please.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, thanks. Thanks very much, Andrew, for your talk. I really enjoyed listening to it. One thing that I wondered while you were speaking is whether, or to what extent, the theories of Habermas and Gadamer are still useful to us today, because I have a feeling that the phenomena that you were talking about mainly in terms of contemporary politics, so the election of Donald Trump and the phenomenon of Brexit, have partly been created by or underpinned by the sense in which there's not really a conversation anymore between people who have different political views, and there's not really a public sphere anymore in the way that Habermas thought that there was, right? And this is partly because social media and the way that we consume political opinion today is so fragmented and decentralized that people who have differing political opinions very rarely actually talk to each other anymore in a kind of dialogue in the way that Gadamer imagines, or in a kind of discussion within the public sphere in the way that Habermas imagines. That is to say that, you know, even in my daily life, I struggle to think of one example where I've actually met in person somebody who voted for Brexit. Yet, you know, over 50% of the British population did. That says something about the type of circles that I move in and who I communicate with. And a similar fragmentation has taken place in the United States. So I wonder whether we don't need some kind of understanding of media theory, or some kind of recognition of the way social media and the internet has changed the public sphere, to really think again about how Habermas and Gadamer would be useful models for understanding misunderstanding today. I still think that they're useful models, but I think that you may need to add to that some understanding of how the internet has changed the game in terms of how people communicate with one another politically. But thank you very much for a really rich and interesting talk.
Thank you. So thank you for your question, Angus. This helps me clarify earlier answers as well. So I think this might connect as well to Professor Gerner's question at the beginning, which is, I think part of the reason why we need to rethink misunderstanding is actually because a model like Habermas's critique of Gadamer is focused on, he calls them systematic and centralized, the misunderstandings that are produced. And I think that while there's a whole debate to be had about the way that big data might feed in dominant messages, the way that messages travel and everything is very different to one office creating a pamphlet that's then handed out. So it's not systematic and produced within the same way. And so I think you're absolutely right. And so the phenomenon with which we communicate demands a rethinking of misunderstanding. So I think you're absolutely right. And that's part of the reason why I feel like Habermas doesn't fully answer our question. The second aspect is not having a conversation in the public sphere. I think this also for me is about rethinking the phenomenon of misunderstanding or understanding, because I'm not sure, I wonder if part of the fragmentation, you know, there was an article recently published, where it was an interview with Habermas in 2019, where he talks about the foundations of the life world being broken. And when I read that, I thought, gosh, I'm not entirely certain whether or not I agree that they were ever fully whole in the way he imagined them to be in the first place. And while I have an enormous respect for him, I think perhaps, I wonder if some of the breakdown we think we are seeing is partially due to the assumptions we might have about how communication can work. Was there ever a public sphere in the first place? I think that's a live question that needs to be rethought. I don't have an answer right now, but I think it's something that demands rethinking.
Thank you. We have a question from Suzanne Hassel. In terms of our present Anglo-German cultural relations, where do you see our misunderstandings now? So that takes us to the Anglo-German side.
Where do I see the misunderstandings now?
Yep.
So I think I think, you know, one example obviously is the example I mentioned that were from the Nick Leakey interview, who very kindly spoke to me about his experience during Brexit as a diplomat, and the fact that there was a very personal reaction in Germany, and I think that heritage is still with us. So that's one thing, is thinking about going forward, and that's perhaps why I was a bit more poetic and self-reflective at the end of the talk, because I think there's a demand for a more self-reflective moment in a national spirit. Whether one voted for Brexit or not, it's clear that there's been a rupture within a larger symbolic order, and so I think there's an importance for reflecting on how to move forward from that as one reflects on a tense point in a relationship. So that's speaking kind of more generally and abstractly. I also think from another more practical perspective, there is a question about the pandemic, but then also the change of leadership that's inevitably going to come with Angela Merkel departing eventually. And I think from a practical perspective, that will bring a new future as well. And that will bring a different chapter. And so there's a need to kind of embrace the future, I suppose. Finally, it's been going to be 5 years since the referendum. And so whatever we may have thought about that, I think it's a moment to hit pause and think, how can we build a future? Those are very general reflections, but that's the best kind of answer I can come up with at this point.
Thank you. The next question comes from Patricia Kemmer. Do you see the possible misunderstanding as a danger for or in democracy?
Do I see misunderstanding as a danger for democracy?
Yeah.
I mean, absolutely. And I think it was interesting, as preparing this talk, I was reflecting on the fact that it wasn't a revolutionary talk. I wasn't adopting a, say, a kind of hard left or anarchist type position. And while I think there are moments for those currents of thought, I reflected that I was thinking as a reformist, and I was thinking as a reformist because of the fact that democracy is struggling because of misunderstandings. So the attempt to address misunderstandings is precisely asking what can be salvaged, what can be reinvented in democracy. So yeah, it's a very simple answer. Absolutely.
The next question comes from Michael Meakin. Andrew, as an American who speaks more than one language, do you think that a monolingual British culture barrier presents an unsurmountable dual problem? First, Britain often deliberately misinterprets for political gain. Second, the lack of knowledge of other languages makes misunderstandings more likely. In short, is the UK doomed to be an island of misunderstanding?
That's a very interesting question, Michael. Thank you. I don't know. I wouldn't dare to say whether the UK is doomed to be an island of misunderstanding. I do think it would behoove us and behoove me to continue to learn languages. I think that's something that I would always be in favor of putting more at the forefront. I'm probably one who believes that should be taught from a very early age, straight on. However, I also think that one of the questions that maybe is a different take on this is reflecting on the question of cosmopolitanism that you hinted at, and reflecting on the fact that it has a particular European heritage in the continent. And maybe one question Britain should ask itself in the moment of global Britain, we've left the European Union, is what cosmopolitanism means to us today. And so again, it's that self-reflective question, I think, that needs to be asked. But yes, we should learn more languages, I agree.
The next question from Matthew Schall. I take that first. Peter Harms has another one, but I take Matthew's first. Wonderful talk, thank you. I read, probably in The Guardian about 2 years ago, that one of the main differences between the understanding of the Brexit dynamic amongst the EU 27 and in the UK, but actually in reality in England, was that all of the EU has at some point been under occupation, whereas the UK hasn't been. Is this perhaps an example of different localities generating conflicting understandings of the same phenomenon? Is it a problem of occupation?
Yeah, I think, so I would be very cautious answering this question because I'm not a historian. And so I don't want to pretend that I'm an expert in this. So I think there's people better suited than me to answer that. That being said, I think it's, on the one hand, there's probably a caution, I would say, about interpreting all Europeans having the same exact experience as I intimated through the talk that Germans had to Brexit. There's probably a plurality of European identities relating to the Brexit process, as opposed to just one mono European identity. But secondly, yes, I think the experience of warfare and place is a fantastic example of something incredibly local in creating a cultural memory that's much more global. And there is the cultural memory of the Blitz in London, but it's very different than the cultural memory of an occupied Paris, et cetera, that the different European nations share. So I think it's a fair point.
Peter Harms, if I may add to that, the question of how consciousness of misunderstanding comes about in the world and how we define the public sphere for creating that consciousness. Creating consciousness, misunderstanding, and how we create that consciousness.
Professor Grenzen, can you just read that out again? How consciousness of misunderstanding?
That the question of how consciousness of misunderstanding comes about
Yep.
in the world and how we define the public sphere for creating that consciousness.
I think that's probably a talk in and of itself. So thank you for that question. I think it's really a talk in and of itself. I would pose a question back, basically, which I would say, what is your assumption about how consciousness of misunderstanding comes about? Is there an assumption that somehow it's very clear what a misunderstanding is and that we could all educate ourselves and combat that? Or I think that's a question I would pose back, is what assumptions might you have about misunderstanding and how that comes about?
Right. I was very grateful to you, Andrew, for pointing out the caesura phenomenon, which after all is truly crucial. And you refer to 1945. It is interesting, is it not, that Jaspers in 45 really develops the concept of Grenzerfahrung. And this is a famous Jasperian concept, the Grenzerfahrung, which he, interestingly enough, describes as the pathway, as it were, between understanding and misunderstanding. So this in itself, he refers to, of course, the legacy of the Third Reich and what comes now after 45. But the Grenzerfahrung somehow also is it not, a cultural form of sorts. It is a space that is defined through experience, and at the same time, it needs to crystallize itself, does it not, with reference to particular problems. And the emphasis on experience here, I think, is interesting because it does link up, does it not, with what you refer to in the context of Locke, the human understanding, which generates somehow forms, requires forms, cultural formations. And Grenzerfahrung in 45, of course, meant something very specific. But even though we don't want to talk just about history here, we want to talk about what we learn from a caesura of this sort. But somehow it relates a little bit also to Angus's question: to what extent can we translate such experiences, such Grenzerfahrungen, into our sphere, as it were, into our localities?
So the way I remember that text by Jaspers is he lists a few things like, was it death, for example, as a Grenzerfahrung. I'm not sure if love was one of them, but he goes through kind of what he considers to be these universal human experiences fundamentally, and border the limits of our human experience. And I think it comes back to thinking about that tension between the local and the global, I suppose, because while I can say as a human being that I share the same qualities with Michelle, Jana, Rüdiger, and all the other people out in cyberspace as somebody who breathes, will die someday, was born someday. There's something incredibly specific about my own experience as an English speaker who grew up in America, who studied in Germany, who now lives in the UK, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm not sure whether or not, I'm hesitant, if I'm honest, to take Jasper's concept into our present context because of the fact that appealing to some kind of universal experience might assume that all experiences are the same. And I think that can be a limit at moments with the more existentialist notion, shall we say, of that being said, I think it's at the same time, there is something in perhaps a more anthropological or biological attempt to universalize. And that's why I think it's really interesting, some of the work being done between the European philosophical heritage and cognitive science, Catherine Malibu being one example, because there's an interesting attempt to understand how parts of the European philosophical heritage might relate to these more cognitive definitions. And I think that's a more interesting area to look for something that would be universalized. I would be hesitant to try to provide a set of common existential experiences that then are applied to everyone. That's just me, where I'm at in this particular journey, but thank you for your question.
Wonderful, thank you so much. We have no further questions now in the chat. I think it is truly on behalf of everyone, when I thank you most warmly, Andrew, for an absolutely fascinating talk and for a truly illuminating discussion. It was in all respects a good conversation, was it not? Ein gutes Gespräch. And thank you also for your contributions out there, wherever you are. It is now only up to me to invite you all most cordially to our next lecture, which is on the 9th of March. And it will be given by our colleague from University of Nottingham, Professor Maike Oergel, and she will be talking about Britain, Germany, and Brexit, the legacy of the 19th century Germanic. So with that, thank you all very much. Stay well and safe. And once again, warmest thanks to you, Andrew. And until very soon, I hope. Bye for now.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.